I used to love Assassin's Creed. There was probably a period of time where I would have called it my favourite game franchise. For a long time, it was really the only franchise that used history as the playground it could properly be for video games. And while the gameplay was never amazing or anything, the stories were always good and the settings were always fantastic. Digital tours through some of the most interesting times and places in human history. That all changed for me with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the point where I feel like Ubisoft truly stopped giving any kind of a shit about historical accuracy or even making good games at all. Their Vikings may not have had horned helmets, but they were absolutely caricatures of what actual Vikings were in all the worst ways. And the game played in some really awful ideas about them as noble raiders, as if that makes any sense at all, as if there's any way to gamify raiding a church and make it seem like you're still the hero. But mostly I just find it to be a horribly bloated, boring mess of a game, and I can't even bring myself to go back and play it all these years later, even though I bought it day one at full price. That was a real win for me.
Help me out here!
Anyway, that's when I fell out with Ubisoft. Why, what was it for you? It was a good reason, right? Ubisoft's numerous workplace misconduct violations, their extremely aggressive monetization schemes, their repetitive game design. It was one of those, right? Please say it was one of those.
And that's what they're deciding to run with. That's why they decided to exclude a Japanese male protagonist in this game in favor of a black one. I'm sure he's gonna blend right in as an assassin in fucking feudal Japan.
No, of course not. It's because they made a black samurai. Okay, so last month Ubisoft announced Assassin's Creed Shadows, the next mainline game in the series, which finally, after 15 years of people asking for it, will be taking the series to feudal Japan. The game will have two protagonists, Nawe, the ninja, who's the stealth-focused character, and Yasuke, the samurai, who's the combat-focused character, and as you can also see, is a black man. If you're, a normal person, unlike myself, your reaction to that information is probably, that's odd, or, that's interesting, and then you move on with your life. Unfortunately, this is the internet, and the normal voices are never the loudest, so of course this has sparked a massive, ongoing, continually unfolding controversy. I've been watching this story unfold over the last month out of morbid curiosity, because sure, it's the same racist backlash we've come to expect from anything these days. But there's a couple things about this story, and Yasuke in particular, that make it more interesting. It sits at the intersection of a couple different cultural phenomena that make it particularly interesting to me. The arguments people are making against the inclusion of this character are fascinating to me because of how fundamentally flawed they are, and how much they expose about the people making them and how they view the world. Now, before we get into this, let me just state the obvious. I am neither black nor Japanese. Even after all this time, Ubisoft is yet to take on my culture. He's a fucking William Wallace game, Ubisoft. You're all about the freedom, and we've got all the freedom you could want, so get on that, you employee abusing fannies. It's not my intention to speak over people, but I am some sort of expert in video games, and specifically the Assassin's Creed franchise, so I'd like to think there's still something I can bring to this conversation. This is no doubt a sensitive issue for a lot of people, but I will try my best to take a fair and balanced approach to this debate. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Black Samurai. There's a lot of different arguments against Yasuke, ranging from it being a racist choice against Japanese people to it being another example of woke ideology and DEI pushing companies trying to invade pop culture, etc, etc. I've addressed that argument more broadly before, particularly in this video, so I want to focus on the argument specific to Yasuke, the accusations of racism against Ubisoft for their use and depiction of this character. But first, let's talk about Yasuke. Unlike all other Assassin's Creed protagonists in the series who are completely made up, Yasuke was a real historical figure who lived in Japan in the 1500s. The exact details of his life were not fully known, but it's speculated that he was born in Mozambique, where he was taken as a slave before eventually ending up as a free man in the service of Jesuit missionaries on a mission to Japan, where at some point he came into the service of Oda Nobunaga, one of the most important men in Japan at the time, who he served until Nobunaga's death, after which the remainder of his life is unknown. So, there you go, he's a real guy. So what's the issue? Well, plenty. If you're racist anyway. Okay, I'm being provocative. Sort of. People are not out there on the internet saying, I hate black people, it's more complicated than that. They deflect from any accusations of racism on their part by talking about optics or historical accuracy, and these different arguments come in many different forms. I wasn't sure how to best go through these arguments, but I decided the most fun way for me would be a numbered list, stopping along the way whenever I find something particularly interesting. So, let's get started. Number 1. Yasuke was not a real samurai.
Yasuke is what they want to say is the first black Japanese samurai, when in all actuality, he was not even a samurai. He was a retainer, so he wasn't even a full-blown samurai.
Alright, so the argument here is that Ubisoft has massively inflated Yasuke's importance in order to fit him into the game. They want to portray him as this badass samurai warrior when in reality he was only a retainer. Now the first question here is, what's a retainer? Let's just check with Google and... oh! Well that was easy. If I was brave, I would move on from this point immediately. I just debunked the argument with a Google search. But let's actually talk about this because I think it exposes something interesting. The wording this guy used, a full-blown samurai, speaks to a deep misunderstanding of what samurai were. Essentially, he thinks samurai are knights. Medieval knights are extremely common in pulp culture and even modern days, so this is an easy mistake to make. Loads of people make this mistake. What makes a knight is that they follow some sort of chivalrous code and they're knighted by a monarch. The Knights of the Round Table are all knights because they serve King Arthur. If they haven't been knighted, they're not a knight, they're just a guy in fancy armour. Knight is a title, and people tend to assume that being a samurai works the same way, but that's not really the case at all. Samurai isn't a title, it's more of a social class. A better analogy for samurai is mercenary. They were soldiers in the service of a daimyo, or a feudal lord. They did have a code called the Bushido Code, but the code was more like guidelines than actual rules. That basically goes for codes of chivalry too, but that's a whole different discussion. People then equate retainer as being something akin to a squire, some kind of lesser form of samurai, but that's not how it is at all. In Yasuke's case, it just means that he wasn't from a noble household, but that doesn't make him less of a samurai because samurai wasn't a title, it was a role. When this became clear, it sparked an edit war on the Wikipedia page for Yasuke, which previously claimed that he was a samurai, with people then trying to change it so it was something more vague so they could win arguments. Charming stuff. Oh, by the way, Wikipedia's source for a lot of this stuff is a book published by 2 historians called African Samurai, so, this isn't very hard information to find. Okay, next. Number 2, isn't Assassin's Creed about stealth? So, Ryan Kinnell already gave his charming view on this point, but yes, he is right. Yasuke would have a pretty hard time blending into a crowd considering that black men were extremely uncommon in Japan at the time. He would naturally draw attention, which would be a problem if he wasn't explicitly stated many times to be the combat-focused character. To me, this criticism is rooted in people who haven't played Assassin's Creed since the Brotherhood days. Social stealth hasn't been a part of the franchise for like 10 years at this point, and this isn't even the first time the series has had 2 characters, with one being the fighter and one being the stealthy one. Syndicate did the same thing in 2015, and people have been complaining about the lack of stealth gameplay for all that time as well. Personally, I don't super care about this criticism. Sometimes I like stealth, sometimes you just want to run in and go on a rampage. I think it's fine for the game to accommodate both approaches. Assassin's Creed was never exactly the most in-depth stealth game in the first place. Having a stealth-focused character is actually a massive improvement in that regard if you're interested in the stealth portions of Assassin's Creed, but that would require remembering that Naui also exists, or caring. Number 3, Western media is erasing Asian men. This one is interesting because I don't think it's completely wrong. It's what we'd more commonly call whitewashing. Look at M. Night Shyamalan's Avatar movie, or the movies like The Karate Kid, or anime adaptations like Death Note, or Dragon Ball, taking stories that are set in Asia, surrounding Asian culture, or inspired by Asian cultures, and sticking a white person in the middle of it so that it will appeal to Western audiences. Hollywood has a very long history of doing this, and it is a problem. And it's not exclusive to Asia at all, it's a prevalent issue for cultures around the world. However, in more recent times, this is a problem that's much less prevalent, as people seem to have finally learned that white people will still watch things without white people in them. The new Avatar live-action adaptation has an all-Asian cast. We've got movies like Shang-Chi or Everything Everywhere All at Once, and most importantly for this case, video games like Ghost of Tsushima, which was developed by an American company and stars a Japanese man. So, while I don't want to downplay people who feel like their culture is being whitewashed, is it really fair to accuse Assassin's Creed Shadows of being part of this trend? Especially since, as you've no doubt noticed, Assassin's Creed Shadows does have a Japanese protagonist. She's right here next to Yasuke, and I find it extremely interesting how much everyone making this argument tries to underplay this point, often deliberately framing the conversation as if Yasuke is the main character of the game when both of them are given equal prominence in all of the marketing material. Whitewashing is a problem, although obviously Yasuke isn't white. But why is it so important that specifically the male protagonist is Asian? If you care about Japanese representation in the Japanese game, you've already got it. Unless, of course, you want to try and argue that female representation is less important than male representation, in which case, good luck with that. This also views Assassin's Creed in a vacuum, which is silly. Let me tell you, we're not lacking for video games about samurais and ninjas, especially Ghost of Tsushima, which literally everyone compared to Assassin's Creed when it first came out. What would be the value in just making Ghost of Tsushima again? Let's boil this down. They're mad because there's never been an East Asian male protagonist in the Assassin's Creed series. There's been East Asian protagonists, there's been Asian male protagonists, and outside of the Assassin's Creed series there's a whole bunch of Japanese samurai protagonists, but all of these qualifiers specifically are a big problem. Now maybe it's just me, but I don't think this is a completely legitimate problem. We're not lacking for Japanese representation in the games industry because Japan is dominant in the games industry. 2 of the 3 major consoles are owned by Japanese companies and absolutely full of games made by Japanese developers. Matt Kim has a really interesting article in IGN where he talks about how, actually, East Asian men have a problem in games of only being represented as samurai, ninjas, or martial arts masters, and Ubisoft adding another one to the pile wouldn't make any difference to actual representation. But, who cares what an actual Asian American thinks of this decision? Because, number 4, Japanese people are not happy.
Here is the like-dislike ratio from Japanese users. It is even worse than the Western release of this trailer. In fact, it's about a 10 to 90 ratio in terms of likes versus dislikes. I think gamers, especially those from Japan, have made it very clear they don't like the direction that this game is going.
In order to deflect from the fact that if you look online, most of the people complaining about this appear to be white, which is not a great look, the case has to be made that Japanese people are mad about this, because then the complaints have some validity. Look, Forbes is reporting on it. Well, this Forbes article is some of the worst, most sloppy journalism I've ever seen in my entire life. Its source is 2 tweets from some guy on Twitter with collages of comments from Japanese gamers complaining about the game's trailer. You can actually see in one image that this guy disliked the trailer, so, not a great start. And if you scroll down his Twitter feed a bit, it's exactly what you'd expect. A whole lot of being horny on main. Also a bunch of complaints about DEI invading video games, how women in games aren't hot enough anymore because of wokeness, and, this. Call me crazy, but I don't think this guy is a completely unbiased source. Now, in all fairness, the comment section of the Japanese trailer is a bit of a shit show in exactly the same way the English trailer is. But of course, this is the internet. We have no way of verifying if any of the people in these comments are actually Japanese or even real people at all. Luckily for us, someone went out onto the streets of Japan and did some real, proper journalism. And it's one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen in my entire life. This is Cabrutus. You may remember him as the guy who set up Sweet Baby Inc. Detected a few months ago. Or not. He's not very memorable. But since the boost he got from that little cultural event, he's trying to turn his sudden online popularity into a YouTube career. And as part of that, he took to the streets of Tokyo to interview some real Japanese people about the trailer. This video is absolute perfection in its sheer failure at trying to prove the point it wants to make. It's badly edited, badly paced, Cabrutus himself has absolutely no charisma as a public speaker or as an interviewer, and he doesn't speak Japanese, so he needs his cameraman to translate everything. Instead of cutting that process down, he just plays it in all its glory. Whenever he shows someone in the trailer, we see them watching the trailer with no reaction at all because no one he was talking to wanted to show their face, so we just watch the same trailer in the corner of the video over and over again. But the best part of the whole video is that absolutely no one in the interviews actually has any problem with the trailer. Most of them think it looks kind of cool.
What do you think about the characters that were depicted in the trailer? Do you think that they fit well the Japanese people future history points?
トレーラーで、登場したキャラクターは日本の文化に、すいません日本の文化を表す感じとか、登場してなんかやっぱ変なのか、大丈夫、別に問題はないかなってと。
なるほど。でも、なんだろうな、難しい。 ちょっとそんなに違和感があったわけではないですけど、まあやっぱなんかそのちょっと海外チックな感じと日本の感じがまあ組み合わせていい感じにまあ見えたかなと思います。
はい、なるほどです。わかりました。
キャラクターの格好も十分適切だと思いますし、使ってる武器等も、その火縄銃だったりしたので、特に変なところはなかったと思います。
全然自分は確かに日本の侍ではあるんですけど、でも全然違和感ないというか、すごくいいと思いますよ。はい。適切だと思います。
はい。わかりました。
You know what? Credit to him for uploading this video at all, even though it pretty much completely disproves his entire argument. Eventually, at the end, he gives up and asks his cameraman his opinion, who naturally says he thinks it's racist. What we actually get from Kabrutus' video, and the perception I've seen from other actual Japanese people online, is that they look at this game the same way I look at, like, The Great Ace Attorney. In The Great Ace Attorney, a Japanese lawyer travels to Victorian London to study British law and eventually overthrow one of the most powerful figures in the British government. Usual Ace Attorney stuff, really. It is absolutely a fantasy idealised version of Britain and British culture. What with this right action is it talk like this, silly? Sherlock Holmes is a prominent character and the prosecutors dressed like they just walked out of Castlevania. It's not even remotely accurate to the reality of Victorian London. It's a depiction of London made by and for Japanese people. And that's fine. It's not hurting anyone. Very few British people are ever actually going to play the games. The games also slap, but that's besides the point. What you need to understand is that Japanese people are not a minority group in Japan. They don't have the same reference for white racism towards Japanese people that we do. Typical Japanese people are not going to perceive Yasuke as a replacement of their culture because they live in their culture. They're surrounded by it every day. Have you ever played Dark Souls? Dark Souls is absolutely full of European architecture and weaponry and armour, but you don't hear a lot of white people complaining about Dark Souls appropriating our culture because we're so submerged in our culture that most people don't even notice. There was no discourse about if it was okay for a Japanese studio to use British cultural icon Sherlock Holmes because, you know, who cares? And from what I can tell, most Japanese people feel the same way that we do about them using our culture. They don't really care. Obviously, there are exceptions. I'm sure there are some Japanese people who are legitimately offended, or worse, some Japanese people who are genuinely racist towards black people. But in general, as far as I can tell, and according to the diligent research of my good friend Kabrutus, most people in Japan don't really care one way or the other. Number 5. His background music is racist.
No, bitch, that's not how this works. The only reason why there is hip-hop music in feudal Japan right now is because the protagonist is a black samurai. That is the only fucking reason.
Greed cannot rule this village. Not while I have breath in my lungs and a blade in my head. I said kill him. I'll wash away his failure with your
Okay, so they've done a sort of traditional Japanese mix with trap music thing for this bit in the trailer, potentially also in the final product. I guess we'll find out. And the argument is that this is racist because trap music is, I guess, primarily associated with black people, and so using it in the background music of a black guy is racist because of stereotyping. Look, I know nothing about music, especially hip-hop music, so this one will be tricky for me to properly respond to. I think they're right to say that this music choice is because the character is black. What I can't say for certain is if this choice is automatically racist because of that, or somehow making fun of black people. I think this is kind of a bop, quite frankly. Is it not racist because the music is good? I have no idea, this is way beyond my area of expertise, but I will say that the Assassin's Creed series has incorporated modern instruments into its music basically since the beginning. Ezio's Family, the most famous piece of music in the entire franchise, has electric guitars mixed into it, a classic Renaissance instrument to be sure. But I will concede that I cannot totally debunk this argument. This might be a little tone deaf on Ubisoft's part, I don't really know, so I'll concede this point for now. Congratulations, you got one. Number 6. A black man murdering and being superior to Asian men is problematic. There are more and less diplomatic ways this argument has been made, and I find this one just so revealing. They contrast it against Resident Evil 5, which has been controversial ever since its release for its depiction of Africans, and just in general the optics of a big beefy white guy mowing down monstrous black men wearing cartoonish tribal masks. It's a bad look. They use this as evidence of a contradiction in woke ideology. Why is this a problem and this is acceptable? And that argument is so ridiculously flawed that I feel stupid for even bothering to debunk it because I think it's extremely obvious what the difference is, but I guess I have to lay it out anyway. Beefy American Special Forces man Chris Redfield mowing down groups of rabid tribal stereotypes on his way through a village in Africa on a mission for the UN is not the same as Yasuke, a man who lives in Japan, respects Japanese culture, works for a Japanese lord, and holds a position of respect in Japanese society, killing bandits. These two things are not even remotely comparable, and to compare the two exposes a deep lack of media literacy and cultural understanding. It shows that you only view the world through the lens of race and can only see people of two different racial groups fighting as a struggle for social and political power and nothing else. That a black man killing a Japanese man is by default a political statement because one is black and one is Japanese. If this is a real argument anyway. Remember, these people don't think Resident Evil 5 is racist. They don't see a problem with its depiction of Africa. They're adopting this argument against Assassin's Creed as a rhetorical gotcha, not because they actually give a shit, but their gotcha doesn't work because they fundamentally don't understand what the criticism of Resident Evil 5 even is. They think the problem is just that it's a white guy who kills black guys. That the argument is that any depiction of one group of people killing another group of people is inherently problematic. It's a gotcha response to an argument that nobody's actually making, or they're just using it as an excuse to say some completely deranged nonsense. Having Japanese people bowing to Yasuke is 100% one of the lead dev's racial domination fetish. These are not the words of a person you need to take seriously. An interesting note about Resident Evil is that the games are made by Capcom, a Japanese studio. They're usually based in America, or at least starring Americans as the protagonists, but they've always been full of weird idiosyncrasies that come from Japanese ideas of American culture. This is how we ended up with all the weirdness in Resident Evil 5. It's a Japanese understanding of Africa filtered through an American lens. The racism of Resi 5 doesn't come from a place of genuine hatred, it comes from a place of ignorance, from people with no cultural understanding of why this imagery is hurtful and dangerous. See, a lot of Gamergate types have this idea of Japan and other East Asian countries as being these havens of creativity where the industry hasn't been infected by woke ideology and people are free of the constraints of political correctness. That's part of the reason I find this situation so interesting, because it's at odds with their idealized version of Japan. And listen, if you watch anime or play Japanese games, there are absolutely some things that you could not get away with in the West, particularly around their portrayal of women. But like the knights and samurai, this is a conflation of two entirely different cultures. Japan is a very homogenous society, around 97.5% of Japanese population according to the CIA. Glad you guys are keeping track of that. That homogeneity means that racism in Japan is completely different to racism in America. It's an entirely different beast. There's an interesting little video on the NPR YouTube channel where they interview a bunch of black people living in Japan, and they all unanimously agree that living in Japan is much better than living in the US because there's no inherent bigotry towards black people, especially by the police. Here in the West, especially in America, black people are a fact of life. If I go out to the shops right now, there's a good chance I'll see a black person also at the shops. In Japan, black people are essentially fictional. They're only familiar with them through movies and TV shows, and that does not paint a whole picture of black people or black culture. One famous story about Yasuke is that when he first met Nobunaga, Nobunaga thought that he was covered in black paint and ordered him washed. That's not racism, that's never seen or heard of a black person before. There are a lot of examples of pretty dodgy portrayals of black people in Japanese media. It's problematic and I'm not trying to defend it, but it doesn't come from a place of hatred, it comes from a place of ignorance. Japan, like anywhere in the world, has its problems with racism, and just like everywhere else in the world, the Black Lives Matter protests were a sparking issue for a lot of cultural issues in Japan. But the claim that Japan is a woke-free haven has always been total projection. People look at Japanese media through their own Western lens, assuming that the creators have the same values and understanding that they do. They don't, and we need to tailor our interpretations accordingly. But back to the original point, is the image of a large black man killing Japanese people inherently problematic? Is the game suggesting that black people are superior to Japanese people? Of course not. That's a deliberately extruded argument with no basis in reality, especially since, as we seem to have forgotten again, the game also has a Japanese protagonist. Number 7. Assassin's Creed is always about natives of the setting.
So, instead of using a Japanese man in a game based in Japan, like they did with the other Assassin's Creed games, Altair, he was an Arab, obviously. One of my favorites, Connor, in Assassin's Creed 3, he was Native American, that was fine. And the most famous of them all, Ezio Auditore, who was Italian.
This is an easy one. No, they aren't. They usually are, but there's been exceptions before. Edward Kenway is not a Caribbean native, he's Welsh. Shay Carmack is Irish born and raised, and his game takes place in North America. Eivor is Norwegian, and the bulk of the game takes place in England. And Revelations had Italian Ezio travelling to Istanbul. They've done outsider stories before. I wonder why people don't care about these guys, it's a mystery. Number 8. The use of Yasuke is virtue signalling.
You guys can't find one Japanese man to pair up with Neo, to base one of your main protagonists in a game set in Japan. And that's why we know that this is quite literally just there to virtue signal. That's all it is.
This is arguably the weakest argument of the bunch because it's a completely unfalsifiable claim. They've got no evidence to support this, they just think it's true because that's how they see the world, as two sides competing in a culture war. I wanted to save it for last though, because really, it's the most important one. It's the one they all mention. The rest of the arguments are just supporting evidence to this fundamental claim. The developers chose to make this game about Yasuke for the woke cookies, for DEI, that it has nothing to do with historical accuracy or wanting to tell an interesting story. They want to make a game about a black guy because woke. But really it's last because it's the one that annoys me the most. It's the one that means I have to make this video like this. When in reality, there are a lot of perfectly valid and interesting reasons to make Yasuke a protagonist. Because after 5 minutes of research on the guy, I wanted to make a game about him too. Yasuke is one of those historical figures who's too interesting to be real, like Chengshi, the prostitute turned pirate queen, or Bass Reeves, the runaway slave turned US Marshal. People whose life story is so cinematic that you just assume it was made up. The man made it from East Africa to Japan in a time when that was almost unheard of. He'd travelled half the world before he was 25. He was bodyguard to one of the most influential and important men in the Catholic Church, and also one of the most important men in Japanese politics, including being present for his betrayal and death. By some historical accounts, he was present for Nobunaga's actual death by seppuku, after which he had to take his head so the enemy couldn't claim it as a trophy. After which Yasuke disappears off the history books. Oh, and I didn't even mention Nobunaga's other name, the Demon King. Speaking as a writer, the drama and opportunity in that situation is intoxicating. It gives you a unique perspective on a pivotal moment in Japanese history, after which the book is open to do whatever you want with your more speculative fiction. It's literally the perfect setup for an Assassin's Creed game. It's too obvious to pass up. He's a narrative goldmine. As evidenced by the fact that this is not Yasuke's first appearance in pop culture. It's probably his most high-profile outing, but I knew who he was before the trailer came out. Netflix released an anime about him a few years ago. He's a boss fight in Nioh. Chadwick Boseman was signed on to play him in a movie before he died. Yasuke captures the imagination, and I wish we could have that discussion, because that discussion is what Assassin's Creed has always fostered at its best. Everyone knows that the series isn't very historically accurate, but what it should do is foster curiosity about the real history. For all its faults over the years, the one thing I've always loved about this series is the genuine enthusiasm it shows for history, showing that history can be just as exciting and interesting as sci-fi and fantasy. I don't want to make a video defending Ubisoft. Ubisoft can go fuck itself, but this nonsense distracts from any genuine discussion of Ubisoft's problems or their positives. It drowns everything in this toxic pool of sludge, and I don't know about you, but I'm very tired of inhaling toxic sludge. When delving into this stuff, it can be difficult to remember that you're dealing with a vocal minority. They don't feel like a minority because there's so many of them, but they are. The Shadows trailer has 8.7 million views. Even if we assume half of those are repeat viewings, the hundreds and thousands of views that these rage videos get are a minority compared to the general population. If you go into the comment sections of YouTube channels that aren't shit, you'll still find plenty of people having completely normal discussions about this game. They are intensely online people, which is why they're so prevalent in online spaces. And this kind of conversation, big, bold, and controversial, is what social media is built for. It spreads like wildfire, which is exactly why I stopped using Twitter earlier this year, which, by the way, has been an extremely positive change in my life. Strongly recommended. They like to point at YouTube dislike ratios as a victory, but YouTube removed dislike counters, remember? Anyone who can see dislikes now is using an extension, and something I discovered a while ago is that those extensions are actually pretty wildly inaccurate. Recently, one of my videos was bombarded with dislikes, and by comparing notes with one of my commenters, we discovered that their counter showed about 20% more dislikes than there actually was. Which, on the scales of the Assassin's Creed trailer, is an extremely high margin for error, so, take any of their comments about dislikes with a grain of salt. Yes, these guys are annoying, and they're making the internet a very unpleasant place to be, but they are not representative of the entirety of humanity. Call me a sap, but I generally think that humans are fundamentally good, even if we need a reminder of that sometimes. And hey, I do have one silver lining for myself. Back in the day, I was also one of those weebs who always wanted Assassin's Creed to go to Japan, and even though I'm old and cynical now, I still feel that little flicker. Talking about this and researching Yasuke has reignited my interest in this franchise a little bit, which I haven't touched since I gave up on Valhalla. I think I want to talk about Assassin's Creed again. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me, as well as a like, a comment, a share, and a subscribe. Although, given the topic of this video, if this video gains any traction, I don't imagine the comments will be a very pleasant place, so just be careful down there. I've had kind of 2 bummer videos in a row. I didn't really mean that. I guess that's just the mood I'm in right now. But if you want to see my previous video about review bombing, it's up here. Or for something a bit lighter, here's a video about a cool indie game.